In the summer of 1997, Apple Computer was exactly 90 days away from total, irreversible bankruptcy. The company that had once sparked a personal computing revolution was bleeding cash. Its stock price had tanked to an all-time low, and the board was desperate. But then, the unthinkable happened. Steve Jobs stood on a stage in Boston, looked out at a stunned crowd, and announced that Apple's ultimate corporate executioner, $100 billion empire that had spent a decade trying to destroy them, had just written them a check for $150 million. That savior was Microsoft, and its billionaire founder, Bill Gates. Today, Apple and Microsoft are two of the most valuable corporations on planet Earth. They dominate our phones, our offices, our cloud infrastructure, and our daily workflows. But to understand how they reached this multi-trillion-dollar peak, you have to realize that their relationship wasn't built on peaceful innovation. It was built on a brutal, decades-long blood feud filled with corporate espionage, blatant plagiarism, and personal betrayal. In this video, we are going inside the most iconic rivalry in business history to find out the truth. How a pair of tech visionaries weaponized code, outmaneuvered government antitrust regulators, and systematically carved up the digital world. Grab your coffee and buckle up, because this is the real story of how Microsoft and Apple fought for the soul of the internet. If you walked past Steve Jobs and Bill Gates in the late 1970s, you would have seen two entirely different anomalies. Jobs was an eccentric, charismatic marketer who viewed computers as high art. Gates was an introverted, ruthless software prodigy who viewed code as pure leverage. And surprisingly, in the early days, they were actually close partners. You see, when Apple was designing the original Macintosh in 1982, the first mass-market computer, with a graphical user interface and a mouse, they didn't have the software capacity to build office tools. So, Jobs invited Bill Gates to Apple's top-secret headquarters. He showed Gates the prototypes, explained the underlying logic of the user interface, and hired Microsoft to build spreadsheet and word processing applications for the Mac. It was a fatal mistake. Gates immediately recognized that the graphical user interface, not the hardware, was the future of computing. And while his engineers were working on Apple's software, Gates quietly assigned a separate team to build a software overlay for IBM computers, a software platform that looked suspiciously identical to the Macintosh interface. They called it Windows. When Jobs found out, he was absolutely furious. He summoned Gates to Apple, screaming that Microsoft had completely ripped them off. But Gates remained entirely calm. He looked directly at Jobs and delivered one of the most famous cold-blooded lines in tech history. "Well, Steve, I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it." Over the next decade, Microsoft executed one of the most brutal, monopolistic strategies ever recorded in business. While Apple insisted on controlling both their hardware and software, charging premium prices for Mac, Bill Gates did the exact opposite. He didn't care about building computers. He licensed Windows to every single computer manufacturer on Earth. IBM, Dell, HP, Compaq, they all ran on Windows. By the early 90s, Microsoft had captured a staggering 90% market share of personal computing. Apple was pushed entirely to the margins, left with just a 5% slice of the market. Microsoft was printing billions, and Bill Gates became the richest man alive, while Apple entered a downward spiral that led to the firing of Steve Jobs himself. By 1995, Microsoft felt completely untouchable. With the release of Windows 95, they didn't just dominate the operating system, they decided to crush the emerging internet browser market by bundling their new Internet Explorer for free into every computer, completely wiping out their rival Netscape. But this extreme aggression backfired horribly. It caught the eye of the United States Department of Justice, who launched a massive antitrust lawsuit to break Microsoft apart. And that brings us back to the mysterious $150 million check Gates wrote to Apple in 1997. Why did Gates save his archrival? It wasn't kindness. It was calculated survival. If Apple went bankrupt, Microsoft would have a literal 100% monopoly on computing. Bill Gates needed Apple alive to show the government that competition still existed. He kept Apple on life support, purely to save his own skin. But Bill Gates grossly underestimated what a desperate Steve Jobs would do with that lifeline. Jobs realized Apple could never defeat Microsoft in the traditional desktop market. The architecture was already locked down. So, Jobs decided to change the battlefield entirely. He shifted Apple's focus away from just personal computers and into the palm of your hand. While Microsoft spent the 2000s bogged down in legal battles, bloated software updates like Windows Vista, and a slow corporate bureaucracy, Apple created a closed ecosystem. They built the iPod, the iTunes Store, and then, in 2007, the iPhone. By controlling both the hardware and software layers of mobile computing. Apple created a high-margin consumer tech empire that generated more cash than any company in history. But the plot twist doesn't end there. By 2010, Apple surpassed Microsoft's market cap, cementing their revenge. But Microsoft didn't die. Under new leadership in the mid-2010s, Microsoft executed their own massive pivot. They stopped worrying about phones and built Azure, a cloud infrastructure behemoth that runs the back-end systems for the world's biggest enterprises. Then, they heavily invested in OpenAI, placing themselves at the absolute frontier of artificial intelligence. Today, the war is no longer about who owns the plastic box sitting on your desk. It's a battle over who controls the modern digital layer of humanity. Apple controls the consumer hardware ecosystem, while Microsoft controls the enterprise cloud and artificial intelligence infrastructure. They are two halves of the same digital coin. The true lesson of the 40-year war between Microsoft and Apple is that in the world of high-tech valuation, absolute dominance is an illusion. If you scale too aggressively, the regulators will come for you. If you stall, a scrappy competitor will out-innovate you. Code carefully, build defensively, and always watch your back, because your biggest rival might just be the one writing your next check. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next breakdown.